They say the best guards are invisible, silent statues who blend into the background of royal life. For 23 years, James Mitchell believed this was his calling, standing at attention in ornate hallways, watching over state dinners, and maintaining perfect composure during the most intimate family moments. This was the life he had chosen when he first donned the scarlet uniform of the Queen's Guard. But what happens when duty collides with humanity? When the people you're sworn to protect become more than just titles and crowns? When a single tear threatens to shatter decades of military discipline? In the heart of Buckingham Palace, where every whisper echoes through centuries of tradition, one guard's emotional journey would challenge everything he thought he knew about service, sacrifice, and the thin line between duty and compassion. This is the story of how James Mitchell discovered that sometimes the greatest act of protection isn't standing perfectly still, it's knowing when to break character and simply be human. What you're about to read isn't just another tale of royal protocol. It's a deeply personal account of how one man's unwavering dedication to the crown led him to moments so profound, so heartbreaking, and so beautiful that even the most disciplined soldier couldn't help but let his guard down. From late-night vigils during family crises to witnessing private celebrations that never made the headlines, James's story reveals the untold emotional landscape that exists behind palace walls. This is the story of a guard who learned that true protection sometimes means showing your heart, not hiding it. James Mitchell had been standing at attention for exactly 3 hours and 47 minutes when he first heard the crying. It was a sound that shouldn't have existed in the gilded corridors of Buckingham Palace, where every emotion was carefully measured and every public appearance choreographed down to the last smile. Yet there it was, soft and broken, drifting from the private sitting room where Her Majesty often took her afternoon tea. The year was 2019, and James had already served the crown for over 2 decades. At 45, his back was permanently straight from years of military precision, his gray eyes trained to notice everything while appearing to see nothing. He had perfected the art of being present yet invisible, a living piece of furniture that breathed but never spoke unless spoken to. Today, however, something was different. The Queen's personal secretary had dismissed the usual afternoon staff earlier than normal, leaving only James and one other guard in the vicinity. Through the slightly open door, he could see Her Majesty seated in her favorite armchair, the one with the worn velvet arms that she refused to have reupholstered because it had been Prince Philip's preferred spot for their evening conversations. In her hands was a letter, and tears were silently tracking down her cheeks. James had seen the Queen in countless situations. He had stood guard during state dinners where foreign dignitaries tested her patience, during family gatherings that grew heated over personal disagreements, and during the long, lonely hours when she worked late into the night signing documents that would affect millions of lives. But he had never seen her cry, not once in all his years of service. The letter in her hands bore the distinctive letterhead of a children's hospital in Manchester. James couldn't read the contents from his position, but he had learned to read body language with the precision of a trained investigator. The way her shoulders trembled slightly, the way she pressed the paper to her chest, the way she looked toward Prince Philip's empty chair as if seeking counsel from someone who could no longer provide it. All of these told a story that no newspaper would ever print. What James didn't know was that the letter contained news about 8-year-old Sarah Thompson, a little girl who had written to the Queen 6 months earlier. Sarah had been battling leukemia and had asked in her carefully penciled letter if the Queen might send her a photograph because her grandmother had told her that the Queen was the strongest woman in the world, and Sarah wanted to be strong too. The Queen had done more than send a photograph. She had arranged for a private visit, sending her personal car to bring Sarah and her family to a quiet tea at Windsor Castle. The visit had been kept entirely private, no press coverage, no official announcements. Sarah had arrived in her wheelchair, wearing a small tiara that her parents had bought from a costume shop, and had curtsied as best she could when presented to Her Majesty. They had spent 2 hours together, talking about Sarah's dreams of becoming a veterinarian and her love of horses. The Queen had shown her the stables and promised that when Sarah got better, she would personally give her riding lessons. The letter now in the Queen's hands informed her that Sarah had passed away 3 days earlier. Her final words, according to her mother, had been about her promise to visit the Queen's horses again when the angels made her strong enough. James watched as the Queen slowly folded the letter and placed it on the side table next to her cold tea. She sat in silence for several minutes, her gaze fixed on something beyond the ornate windows. Then, In a voice so quiet that James almost missed it, she whispered, "Philip, help me understand why the good ones always go first." It was in that moment that James Mitchell first felt the crack in his professional armor. For 23 years, he had maintained perfect emotional distance from the people he protected. They were symbols, institutions, representatives of something larger than themselves. But, sitting there in her private grief, Queen Elizabeth wasn't a symbol. She was a grandmother, a widow, a woman who had just lost a little friend and had no one to comfort her in her sorrow. James felt his eyes begin to water. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was about to break the most fundamental rule of his profession. Guards don't cry. Guards don't feel. Guards certainly don't empathize with their principals to the point where they share their pain. Yet as he watched the Queen sit alone with her grief, James found that all his training, all his discipline, all his years of emotional detachment meant nothing in the face of witnessing such raw human sorrow. He tried to regain his composure, focusing on the familiar routine of his duties. Count the windows, note the positions of exits, maintain situational awareness. But his eyes kept returning to the lone figure in the armchair, and each glance made the tightness in his chest grow stronger. The Queen suddenly stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. From his position, James could see her reflection in the glass, and what he saw there changed something fundamental in his understanding of his role. She wasn't looking at the gardens at all. She was looking at her own reflection, and in her eyes was a loneliness so profound that it seemed to fill the entire room. 23 years, she said to her reflection, though James realized she might have been talking to him, or to Prince Philip's memory, or to no one at all. 23 years since Diana, and I still don't know how to comfort a grieving mother. The reference to Princess Diana sent another shock through James's system. He had been on duty the night the news came in about the car accident in Paris. He had watched the Queen struggle with how to respond to the public's grief while managing her own family's private devastation. He had seen her practice her speech about the people's princess in front of a mirror, trying to find the right words to acknowledge a loss that the entire world was mourning. But this was different. This wasn't about public duty or royal protocol. This was about a woman who had spent her entire life comforting others and had no one to comfort her when she needed it most. James made a decision that would have horrified his younger self. He cleared his throat softly, just enough to acknowledge his presence without startling her. The Queen turned from the window, and, for a moment, their eyes met directly. In that brief exchange, James saw something that changed everything. She wasn't surprised by his acknowledgement. If anything, she looked relieved that someone else was sharing this moment with her. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual, "I'm very sorry for your loss." The words hung in the air between them, a complete violation of protocol that somehow felt like the most natural thing in the world. The Queen studied his face for a long moment, and James was certain that his career was over. He had broken character, acknowledged emotion, and spoken without being spoken to. By every rule he had been taught, he had failed in his duty. Instead, the Queen's expression softened, and she nodded slowly. "Thank you, James," she said, and the use of his first name sent another shock through his system. Sometimes the hardest part of this job is grieving alone. In that moment, James Mitchell understood that his role was about to change forever. He was no longer just a guard protecting a symbol. He was a human being witnessing another human being's pain, and his duty now extended beyond physical protection to something far more complex and meaningful. The afternoon light was fading as the Queen returned to her chair and picked up another letter from the stack on the side table. James resumed his position, but something fundamental had shifted. He was still standing at attention, still maintaining his professional demeanor, but now he was also bearing witness to a grief that the world would never see. As the hours passed, and the Queen continued reading letters from children who would never grow up to fulfill their dreams, James felt the weight of a new responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just protecting the Queen's physical safety. He was protecting her emotional well-being, her privacy, and her right to grieve as a human being rather than as an institution. When his shift ended that evening, James walked home through the London streets with a completely different understanding of what it meant to serve the crown. He had always thought that duty meant emotional detachment, that professionalism required the suppression of human feeling. But now he realized that sometimes the most professional thing you could do was acknowledge the humanity in the person you were sworn to protect. That night, for the first time in 23 years, James Mitchell went home and cried for someone other than himself. He cried for a little girl named Sarah who would never ride the Queen's horses, for a woman who carried the grief of millions on her shoulders, and for his own long-buried capacity for compassion that had finally been awakened by a single moment of shared sorrow. He didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning of a journey that would test every assumption he had ever made about duty, service, and the delicate balance between professional distance and human connection. 6 months after the incident with Sarah's letter, James found himself assigned to what the staff quietly referred to as the difficult duty. It was Christmas Eve, 2019, and instead of standing guard at the usual state functions, he had been posted outside Prince Andrew's private study at Windsor Castle. The Duke of York had been effectively withdrawn from public life following the controversy surrounding his association with Jeffrey Epstein, and the royal family was navigating one of its most challenging periods in modern history. James had arrived at his post at 8 in the evening, expecting a quiet night of standard security duty. What he discovered instead was a family in the midst of a crisis that no amount of royal training could have prepared them for. Through the partially open door of the study, he could hear voices engaged in what was clearly a painful conversation. The Queen was there, along with Prince Charles and Princess Anne. Prince Andrew sat slumped in a leather chair that seemed too large for him, looking nothing like the confident naval officer who had served with distinction in the Falklands War. The contrast was jarring for James, who remembered standing guard during Andrew's triumphant return from that conflict nearly 40 years earlier, when he had been hailed as a hero. The institution must come first, Prince Charles was saying, his voice strained with the weight of difficult decisions. We've discussed this repeatedly. There's no other choice. He's still my son, the Queen replied, and James was struck by how small her voice sounded in the large room. Whatever he's done, whatever mistakes he's made, he's still my child. James had been trained to ignore private conversations, to treat overheard dialogue as if it had never been spoken. But, standing there on Christmas Eve, listening to a mother struggle between her maternal instincts and her duty to the crown, he found that professional detachment was no longer possible. The conversation continued for over an hour, touching on legal implications, public perception, and the impossible choice between protecting one family member and protecting the institution that the family represented. What struck James most profoundly was the Queen's quiet anguish. She had spent 70 years balancing personal desires with public duty, but this was different. This wasn't about choosing between a holiday with her grandchildren and a state obligation. This was about choosing between her role as a sovereign and her role as a mother, and James could see the toll it was taking on her. Prince Andrew himself said little during the conversation. When he did speak, it was with the voice of a man who understood that his life as he had known it was over. He talked about his daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, and how the scandal would affect them. He mentioned his military service and the charities he had supported, speaking of them as if they belonged to someone else's life. I never meant for any of this to touch the family, he said at one point, his voice breaking slightly. I thought I could handle it privately, keep it away from the institution. Princess Anne, ever practical, responded with characteristic directness. Good intentions don't repair public trust, Andrew. The damage is done, and now we have to manage the consequences. James watched through the crack in the door as the Queen reached over and took her son's hand. It was such a simple gesture, but, in that moment, she wasn't the sovereign offering counsel to a wayward duke. She was a mother comforting her child, and James felt that familiar tightening in his chest that had become his body's response to witnessing these intensely human moments. The meeting broke up near midnight with no clear resolution, only an agreement to continue discussions after the Christmas holiday. As the family members filed out, James maintained his position, but the Queen lingered behind with Prince Andrew. What happened next would stay with James for the rest of his life. The Queen, this woman who had maintained perfect composure through decades of public scrutiny, broke down completely. She leaned forward in her chair and sobbed with the raw grief of a mother watching her child's life fall apart. Prince Andrew moved from his chair to kneel beside her, and they held each other in a way that stripped away every layer of royal protocol and revealed them as simply a mother and son in pain. I'm so sorry, Mummy, Andrew whispered, using the childhood name that the royal children had always called their mother in private. I'm so very sorry for what I've brought on the family. The Queen stroked his hair, a gesture James had seen her make countless times with her grandchildren when they were small. I know you are, she replied. But sorry doesn't change what happens next. We have to think about Charles, about William, about the future of everything we've worked to preserve. James felt tears starting in his own eyes again, and this time he didn't fight them. Standing there in the corridor of Windsor Castle on Christmas Eve, he was witnessing the complete breakdown of two people who had spent their lives in service to something larger than themselves, only to find that service demanding the ultimate sacrifice, the relationship between a mother and her son. When Prince Andrew finally left the study, the Queen remained behind. James could see her through the doorway, sitting alone in the same chair where she had been comforting her son moments before. She looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying impossible burdens for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to rest. James made another decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. He stepped into the doorway and cleared his throat softly. "Your Majesty," he said gently, "perhaps you should try to get some rest." The Queen looked up at him with eyes red from crying. "James," she said, and again the use of his first name created that sense of intimacy that transcended their official roles. "How long have you been standing out there?" "Since 8 o'clock, ma'am." She studied his face for a moment, taking in his expression of genuine concern. "You heard everything, didn't you?" James hesitated, knowing that the proper response would be to deny having heard anything, to maintain the fiction that guards were deaf and blind to private family matters. Instead, he chose honesty. "Yes, ma'am, I did." The Queen nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer. "And what do you think, James? What does a man who has spent his life protecting this family think about what you just witnessed?" It was an extraordinary question, one that no monarch should have been asking a security guard. But James realized that the Queen wasn't asking him as a sovereign seeking counsel from a subject. She was asking as a woman seeking perspective from someone who had observed her family for over 2 decades, someone who knew them not just as royal figures, but as human beings. "I think," James said carefully, choosing each word with great deliberation, "that you're facing an impossible choice, and there's no right answer. But I also think that whatever decision you make will be guided by love, even if it doesn't look that way from the outside." The Queen was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. "Love," she repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose that's what this all comes down to, isn't it? Love for one's son, love for the institution, love for the country. But what happens when all these different kinds of love pull you in different directions?" James found himself stepping further into the room, crossing another invisible line of protocol. "I think, ma'am, that sometimes loving someone means making choices that hurt both of you, but protect something larger. And I think that the weight of making those choices changes you forever." Spoken like a man who understands sacrifice, the Queen observed. "You've given your life to protecting our family, James. You've missed Christmas mornings with your own children, missed birthdays and anniversaries, and all the small moments that make a life worth living. Why do you do it?" The question caught James off guard, partly because it was so personal, and partly because he wasn't sure he had ever articulated the answer, even to himself. "Because," he said slowly, "someone has to stand guard over the things that matter. And your family, what you represent, the stability you provide, that matters to millions of people who never get to see moments like this, who never have to know the cost of that stability." The Queen smiled sadly. "And what about the cost to you, James? What about the price you pay for being witness to our private struggles?" James thought about the question seriously before answering. "I suppose the cost is that once you really see people as human beings, you can never go back to seeing them as symbols. And that makes everything more complicated, but also more real." "More real," the Queen mused. "Yes, I think that's exactly right. Tonight feels more real than anything that will happen in tomorrow's Christmas broadcast, doesn't it?" They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, two people who had spent decades in the same orbit, but were only now truly seeing each other. Finally, the Queen stood and walked toward the door. "James," she said as she passed him, "thank you for your honesty tonight. And thank you for caring about us as people, not just as your duty." As she left the study, James remained behind for a moment, looking around the room where he had just witnessed one of the most painful conversations he had ever heard. The space still seemed to echo with the raw emotion that had filled it, and James understood that his role in the royal household had fundamentally changed once again. He was no longer just a protector of physical safety or even a witness to private grief. He had become something unprecedented in his experience, a confidant, someone trusted with not just the family's security, but with their emotional well-being. The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and deeply meaningful. Walking back to his post outside the study, James reflected on how far he had come from the young guardsman who had believed that duty meant emotional disconnection. Now he understood that real duty sometimes meant allowing yourself to be changed by the people you served, to let their humanity awaken your own, and to accept that true protection sometimes required breaking the very rules you had been taught to uphold. Christmas morning would bring the usual public celebrations, the carefully orchestrated displays of royal unity and tradition. But James would always remember this Christmas Eve as the night he learned that love and duty weren't always in harmony, and that sometimes the greatest service you could provide was simply being present for someone else's pain. The pandemic changed everything, even inside the walls of Windsor Castle. By March 2020, James found himself part of a reduced security detail protecting what the media had dubbed HMS Bubble, the small group of staff who remained with the Queen and Prince Philip during their isolation. For the first time in his career, James wasn't just observing royal life from the periphery. He was living it, sleeping in staff quarters, eating meals prepared in the same kitchen that served the royal family, and sharing the strange, suspended reality of a world that had suddenly stopped. It was during these unprecedented months that James witnessed something that would challenge every assumption he had ever made about duty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of devotion. Prince Philip, now 99 years old and visibly frail, had been suffering from what the palace diplomatically called age-related health issues. What James observed from his daily posts was a man engaged in a fierce battle with his own mortality, fought with characteristic stubbornness and an absolute refusal to acknowledge defeat. The Duke of Edinburgh had always been intimidating to staff. Even in his advanced age, he possessed a sharp intelligence and a directness that could reduce grown men to stammering apologies. James had been on the receiving end of Philip's legendary impatience more than once over the years, usually when security protocols interfered with the Duke's desire to maintain some semblance of normal life. But during the pandemic isolation, James saw a different side of the man who had spent 70 years walking 3 steps behind the woman he loved. It started with small things. Philip would emerge from the Queen's sitting room looking confused, as if he couldn't quite remember where he was or what he had been doing. He would stand in the corridor for several minutes, gathering himself, before continuing to whatever appointment or activity had been planned for him. James began to recognize these moments and would position himself casually nearby, ready to offer assistance without making the Duke feel diminished. One evening in early April, James was stationed outside the Queen's private apartments when he heard raised voices from within. It was unusual enough to warrant attention, but what he heard when he listened carefully was more unsettling than any argument he might have expected. "I can't find the bloody papers," Philip was saying, his voice carrying a frustration that bordered on panic. "The constitutional documents, the ones about Charles and the succession, they were right here on the desk." "Philip, darling," came the Queen's patient voice, "we moved those papers to the study last week. Don't you remember? We organized everything together." "No," Philip replied sharply. "No, that's not right. I put them here specifically because the Prime Minister needs to see them tomorrow. You must have moved them. You're always moving my things." James heard the Queen's sharp intake of breath. In all his years of service, he had never heard the Duke speak to his wife with such accusatory tone. More troubling still was the silence that followed, stretching so long that James began to worry something had happened. When the Queen finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "Philip, there's no meeting with the Prime Minister tomorrow. We haven't had any official meetings since the lockdown began. Don't you remember? We've been isolated here since March." The silence that followed was even longer and more charged than the first. James could picture Philip's face as the reality of his confusion settled in, and he found himself holding his breath as he waited for the Duke's response. Philip began, then stopped. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, uncertain in a way that Philip had never been uncertain. "I don't remember. Why don't I remember?" James heard movement within the room, and through the slight gap in the door, he caught a glimpse of the Queen moving to Philip's side. She guided him to his favorite chair, the one positioned so he could see both the television and the window overlooking the gardens. "It's all right," she said softly, and James was struck by how naturally she had shifted into a caretaking role. "Your mind is just tired. It's been a difficult few months for all of us." "No," Philip said firmly, some of his characteristic determination returning to his voice. "No, it's not just tired. I'm losing it, aren't I? My mind is going." The stark honesty of the admission hung in the air like a physical presence. James felt that familiar tightening in his chest as he realized he was witnessing one of the most private and painful conversations of the royal couple's 73-year marriage. "We'll face it together," the Queen said simply. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together, just as we always have." Over the following weeks, James observed the heartbreaking progression of Philip's decline. Some days were better than others. There were moments when the Duke seemed entirely himself, sharp and engaged, offering commentary on the news or joking with the staff about the absurdity of their situation. But there were increasingly frequent periods of confusion when Philip would become frustrated by his inability to remember simple things or follow conversations that would have been effortless just months before. The Queen adapted to these changes with a grace that James found both inspiring and deeply moving. She began to structure their days around Philip's better moments, scheduling any necessary conversations or decisions for the mornings when his mind was clearest. She created routines that helped orient him, subtle cues that reminded him where he was and what was happening without making his confusion obvious. James watched her transform from wife to caregiver without ever losing her dignity or allowing Philip to lose his. When Philip forgot the names of staff members he had known for decades, the Queen would smoothly provide the information without making it seem like a correction. When he repeated the same story multiple times in a single conversation, she listened with the same attention she had shown the first time. Most remarkably, James observed how the Queen protected Philip's pride even as his capabilities diminished. When Philip could no longer follow the complex briefings that had once been central to his daily routine, she arranged for simplified versions to be prepared. When his handwriting became too unsteady for correspondence, she began dictating his responses to letters, always framing it as her need for his input rather than his need for assistance. One evening in late May, James was stationed outside their sitting room when he overheard a conversation that crystallized everything he had been witnessing. The Queen was reading to Philip from a biography of Ernest Shackleton, one of his favorite historical figures. Philip had been listening quietly, occasionally offering comments about the explorer's leadership during the Endurance expedition. "Remarkable man," Philip said when the Queen finished the chapter. "Takes real character to keep a crew together when everything's falling apart around you." "Yes," the Queen agreed, "but I think the real test of leadership isn't how you handle the dramatic moments. It's how you handle the slow, grinding challenges. The ones that wear you down day after day with no clear end in sight." Philip was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Like what we're doing now." "Like what we're doing now," the Queen confirmed softly. James understood that they weren't talking about the pandemic anymore, or about Shackleton's expedition. They were talking about the slow, relentless challenge of watching someone you love slip away, piece by piece, and the leadership it required to navigate that journey with grace. "I'm sorry," Philip said suddenly, his voice heavy with an emotion James had never heard from him before. "I'm sorry you have to watch this happen to me. I'm sorry I can't be the man you married anymore." "Oh, Philip," the Queen replied, and James could hear tears in her voice despite her efforts to control them. "You are exactly the man I married. You're still the young lieutenant who asked me to dance at that party in 1946. You're still the man who gave up his naval career to support mine. You're still the person who makes me laugh when everything else feels impossible. But I can't remember things. I can't help you with the work anymore. I can barely follow a conversation. Then, we'll make new ways to be together," the Queen said firmly. "We'll find different conversations to have. We'll create new routines that work for who we are now, not who we used to be." James listened as they talked about practical arrangements, how to modify Philip's schedule, which staff members he was most comfortable with, how to maintain his sense of purpose even as his capabilities changed. But underneath the practical discussion was something more profound, a couple redefining their relationship in the face of inevitable loss, choosing love over convenience, presence over efficiency. Later that evening, after the Queen had helped Philip to bed, James encountered her in the corridor outside their apartments. She looked exhausted in a way that went far beyond physical tiredness, and James realized that she had been carrying this burden largely alone, protecting not just Philip's dignity, but shielding the rest of the family from the full reality of his decline. "Your Majesty," James said softly, "is there anything I can do to help?" The Queen looked at him with surprise, as if she had forgotten he was there. "James," she said, "how much of this have you been witnessing?" "Enough to understand that you're managing something very difficult," he replied carefully. The Queen studied his face for a long moment, taking in his expression of genuine concern. "You know, in all the years you've been protecting us, I don't think I've ever asked you about your own family. "Are you married, James?" The personal question caught him off guard. "Yes, ma'am. 28 years this September." "And have you ever had to watch someone you love struggle with illness?" James thought of his own father's battle with dementia 5 years earlier, the slow erosion of the man who had taught him everything about duty and service. "Yes, ma'am, I have." The Queen nodded slowly. "Then, you understand that sometimes love means accepting help when you're not sure how to ask for it." James realized that this was as close as the Queen would ever come to requesting personal support. "Whatever you need, ma'am," he said simply. "I need someone to watch over him when I can't," she said quietly. "Someone who understands that his dignity is more important than his safety, that his sense of purpose matters more than his comfort. Someone who can see past the confusion to the man he still is inside." "I understand," James replied, and in that moment he realized that his role had evolved once again. He was no longer just a guard or even a confidant. He was becoming a caregiver, someone entrusted with protecting not just the physical safety of the royal family, but their emotional well-being and their ability to age with dignity. As the weeks passed, James developed an almost intuitive understanding of Philip's needs and moods. He learned to recognize the signs of an approaching period of confusion and would quietly arrange for distractions or changes of routine that helped the Duke maintain his composure. He became expert at the delicate art of providing assistance without making it obvious, of being present without being intrusive. Most importantly, James learned to see Philip not as a failing elderly man, but as someone engaged in the final act of a lifetime of service. Even as his mind faltered, Philip continued to ask about the Queen's schedule, to worry about her workload, to try to find ways to support her even when he couldn't remember what day it was. Watching this daily display of devotion, James came to understand that true love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about showing up for each other day after day, even when showing up became increasingly difficult. It was about choosing to see the person you loved rather than the disease that was taking them away. This understanding would prove invaluable in the months to come, as James prepared to witness one of the most profound displays of human grace he would ever encounter. The Queen's final months with the man who had been her constant companion for over 70 years. April 9, 2021, would forever be etched in James Mitchell's memory as the day he learned the difference between guarding a crown and protecting a broken heart. He had arrived for his morning shift at Windsor Castle to find the usual bustle of staff activity replaced by an unusual quiet, the kind of silence that settles over a place where something significant has happened overnight. Dr. Williams, Philip's personal physician, was leaving the royal apartments as James took his post. The doctor's expression told James everything he needed to know before any official announcement was made. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 99, just 2 months before his 100th birthday. James had been present for many significant moments in royal history, but nothing had prepared him for witnessing the immediate aftermath of such a personal loss. The woman he had watched care for her husband through his final years was now a widow, and the weight of that transformation was visible in every aspect of the castle's atmosphere. The Queen emerged from her private apartments 3 hours after James's arrival, and what he saw stopped him completely in his professional tracks. She was impeccably dressed as always, her hair perfectly arranged, her posture erect and dignified. But her eyes held a hollowness that seemed to echo through the corridors of the castle. She looked like someone who had suddenly found herself in a familiar place that no longer felt like home. "James," she said when she noticed him at his post, and her voice was steady but carried an undertone of profound fatigue. "I suppose you've heard." "Yes, ma'am," James replied softly. "I'm very sorry for your loss." The Queen nodded and was quiet for a moment, looking down the corridor toward the sitting room where she and Philip had spent their final months together. 73 years, she said, almost to herself. "I'm not sure I remember how to be Elizabeth without being Elizabeth and Philip." It was one of the most vulnerable statements James had ever heard from her, and it crystallized something he was only beginning to understand. The Queen wasn't just mourning the loss of her husband. She was confronting the dissolution of an identity that had defined her for nearly 3/4 of a century. Over the next several days, James observed the complex machinery of royal protocol swing into action around the Queen's grief. There were arrangements to be made, guest lists to be finalized, ceremonial details to be coordinated. The funeral, restricted by pandemic protocols to 30 attendees, would require all the precision of a state occasion while acknowledging the intimate nature of a family's loss. What struck James most profoundly was watching the Queen navigate between her private grief and her public obligations. In meetings with palace officials, she was focused and decisive, discussing everything from the order of service to the positioning of cameras with characteristic attention to detail. But, in the quiet moments between official duties, James could see the profound disorientation of someone whose life had been completely restructured overnight. 3 days before the funeral, James was stationed outside the Queen's study when he heard something that made him realize the depth of her struggle. She was on the phone with someone, and, while he couldn't make out all the words, he could hear the tone of frustrated sadness in her voice. "No, I don't think you understand," she was saying. "I can't simply choose different music because it's what people expect. This isn't a state funeral, it's Philip's funeral." And Philip hated sentimental music. He would have wanted something that reflected who he actually was, not who people think he should have been. James realized she was fighting for the right to honor her husband's memory in a way that reflected their actual relationship rather than the sanitized version that royal protocol typically demanded. It was a battle between authentic grief and institutional expectations, and James could hear how exhausting that battle was becoming. When the call ended, the Queen emerged from her study looking more defeated than James had ever seen her. She noticed him at his post and stopped, as if gathering the energy to speak. "James," she said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am. In your experience, what do people actually want from grief? Do they want the truth of it, or do they want the comfortable version that doesn't make them uncomfortable?" It was an extraordinarily personal question, one that spoke to the Queen's struggle between her role as a public figure and her need to process loss as a private individual. James considered his answer carefully. "I think," he said slowly, "that people want to believe that love is real, even when it's difficult or complicated. And sometimes that means showing them grief that doesn't look the way they expect it to look." The Queen studied his face for a moment. "Philip wasn't perfect, you know. He was stubborn and impatient, and sometimes quite difficult. But he was also the most genuinely himself person I ever knew. He never pretended to be anything other than exactly who he was." "That sounds like someone worth grieving honestly," James replied. "Yes," the Queen said softly. "I think you're right about that." The funeral itself was unlike anything James had experienced in his years of royal service. The combination of pandemic restrictions and genuine grief created an atmosphere that was both deeply ceremonial and remarkably intimate. As the Queen sat alone in the chapel, separated from her family by social distancing requirements, James felt the full weight of her isolation. From his position near the chapel entrance, James could see the Queen's profile throughout the service. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed but not unreadable. During the hymns that she and Philip had chosen together, James saw her lips moving silently with the words. When the last post played, he watched her close her eyes briefly, as if drawing strength from the familiar military honor that Philip would have appreciated. But it was during the removal of Philip's coffin that James witnessed something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the pallbearers lifted the coffin to carry it from the chapel, the Queen looked directly at it and whispered something so quietly that only someone watching her lips carefully could have understood it. James was close enough to see that she said, "Thank you." 2 simple words that contained the weight of a lifetime of shared service, partnership, and love. In that moment, James understood that he was witnessing not just the end of a marriage, but the conclusion of one of the most significant partnerships in modern royal history. After the funeral, the castle felt fundamentally different. The rhythms that had defined daily life for decades were suddenly disrupted. No one quite knew how to adjust the Queen's schedule when half of the conversations that had structured her days were no longer possible. Staff members found themselves uncertain about protocols that had always involved both the Queen and the Duke. James noticed that the Queen began spending long periods in the sitting room where she and Philip had shared their final months together. She would sit in her usual chair, but her gaze would often drift to Philip's empty chair across from her. Sometimes she would speak aloud, as if continuing conversations that had been interrupted rather than ended. "The Prime Minister wants to discuss the environmental summit," she might say to the empty chair. "You would have had strong opinions about that carbon reduction proposal." James realized that she was processing not just the loss of her husband, but the loss of her primary advisor, the person who had helped her think through complex issues for over 70 years. The Queen was learning to make decisions alone for the first time since she was 25 years old. One evening, about 2 weeks after the funeral, James found the Queen standing in the corridor outside Philip's former study. The door was open, and she was looking inside at the room that had been left exactly as Philip had used it, down to the reading glasses on his desk, and the newspapers folded to the crossword puzzle he had been working on before his final illness. "I keep expecting him to walk out of there," she told James without turning around. "For 70 years, I always knew where to find him when I needed his advice. Now I have questions, and there's nowhere to go with them." "What kind of questions?" James asked gently. The Queen was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Whether I'm making the right decisions about Harry and Meghan, whether we're handling the Andrew situation properly, whether the monarchy can survive all these changes, or if we're just preserving something that's outlived its usefulness." James was struck by the profound loneliness in her voice. These were questions that the Queen had always worked through in partnership with Philip, and now she was facing them alone at an age when most people were no longer expected to make consequential decisions. "I think," James said carefully, "that the fact that you're asking these questions means you're still the right person to be making the decisions." The Queen turned to look at him, and James saw something in her expression that he hadn't expected, a kind of quiet gratitude for his willingness to engage with her uncertainty rather than offering empty reassurances. "You've been watching our family for over 20 years, she said. "What do you think happens next? What does the monarchy look like without Philip's influence?" It was an extraordinary question for a monarch to ask a security guard, but James had come to understand that their relationship had evolved far beyond traditional boundaries. The Queen was asking him as someone who had observed the family's dynamics from a unique perspective, someone who understood both their public obligations and their private struggles. "I think," James replied thoughtfully, "that the institution will adapt because you'll find new ways to fulfill its purpose. And I think Philip would expect you to keep moving forward, not because it's easy, but because it's what the work requires." The Queen nodded slowly. "Yes, I think you're right about that." Philip never had much patience for dwelling on what couldn't be changed. As the months passed, James watched the Queen gradually develop new routines and rhythms that reflected her changed circumstances. She began inviting different family members to fill some of the advisory role that Philip had played. She started having longer conversations with prime ministers and other officials, taking more time to work through complex issues without Philip's immediate input. Most remarkably, James observed how the Queen's grief gradually transformed from acute loss into a kind of continuing conversation with Philip's memory. She would still address his empty chair occasionally, but now it seemed less like an inability to accept his absence, and more like a way of honoring the perspective he would have brought to current challenges. James came to understand that witnessing authentic grief had taught him something fundamental about resilience. The Queen wasn't recovering from Philip's death in the sense of returning to who she had been before. Instead, she was discovering who she could become in the absence of the partnership that had defined her adult life. It was a process that required not just emotional strength, but a willingness to reinvent herself at the age of 95. This transformation would prove to be essential preparation for the final chapter of James's service, as he prepared to support the Queen through her own confrontation with mortality and her efforts to ensure a smooth transition for the institution she had served for over 70 years. The summer of 2022 marked James Mitchell's 26th year of service to the royal family, and what would prove to be the final chapter of the most extraordinary relationship of his professional life. The Queen, now 96 and increasingly frail following Philip's death, had begun what palace insiders quietly referred to as the transition, though no one spoke these words aloud in her presence. James had been reassigned to Balmoral Castle for the Queen's traditional summer retreat, but this year felt different from the dozens of previous Scottish sojourns he had overseen. The Queen moved more slowly through the castle corridors, relied more heavily on her walking stick, and tired more easily during her daily activities. More significantly, she had begun having conversations about legacy and continuity that suggested she was actively preparing for the end of her reign. It was during these final months that James witnessed what he would later recognize as one of the most graceful and deliberate conclusions to a life of service he had ever observed. The Queen wasn't simply aging. She was consciously completing her life's work with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her entire reign. The first indication that something significant was approaching came in early August, when James noticed the Queen spending increasing amounts of time in her private study, working on what appeared to be personal correspondence. These weren't the usual official letters that comprised her daily routine, but handwritten notes that she wrote slowly and carefully, often pausing to consider each word. One morning, James overheard her on the phone with Prince Charles, and the tone of the conversation was unlike their usual discussions of royal business. "I've been thinking about the speech I gave on my 21st birthday," the Queen was saying. "Do you remember? I said that my whole life, whether it be long or short, would be devoted to service. I think it's time to discuss what happens when that service reaches its natural conclusion." James felt a chill run through him as he realized what he was hearing. The Queen wasn't talking about retirement or stepping back from duties. She was talking about death, about the end of her reign, with the same practical directness she brought to all matters of constitutional importance. Over the following weeks, James observed the Queen methodically addressing what appeared to be a comprehensive list of final preparations. She had extended private meetings with each of her children, conversations that often lasted several hours, and left all parties emotionally drained. She spent time reviewing and updating her will, consulting with lawyers about the distribution of her personal effects, and the transfer of various symbolic objects that would pass to the next monarch. Most poignantly, James watched the Queen organize what she called memory sessions with long-serving staff members. These were informal conversations where she would invite people who had worked with her for decades to share recollections of significant moments they had witnessed together. James was both honored and deeply moved when she asked him to participate in one of these sessions. "James," she said during their private conversation, "you've been present for some of the most difficult moments of my reign. The death of Diana, Philip's decline, the various family crises we've navigated. How do you think we managed to get through all of that?" It was a profound question, one that asked James to reflect not just on what he had observed, but on what he had learned about resilience, duty, and the relationship between public service and private struggle. "I think," James said carefully, "that you survived those challenges because you never lost sight of the difference between the institution and the individuals who serve it. You protected the monarchy by being willing to sacrifice personal comfort, but you protected your family by remembering that they were people, not just symbols." The Queen nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I think that's right. The hardest part was always balancing those two responsibilities. Sometimes I wonder if I got that balance right." "May I speak honestly, ma'am?" "Please do." James took a deep breath before continuing. "I think you got it right more often than not. And I think the times when it was most difficult were the times when there was no right answer, only different kinds of wrong ones." The Queen was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. "You know, James, in all my years of service, I'm not sure anyone ever told me that it was acceptable to make imperfect choices. Everyone always expected certainty, even in impossible situations. Maybe," James suggested gently, "that's something the next generation can do differently. Maybe they can be more open about the uncertainty that comes with these responsibilities." "Perhaps," the Queen agreed. "Charles will face different challenges than I have, and I hope he'll feel more freedom to address them in his own way." As August progressed, James noticed subtle changes in the Queen's behavior that suggested she was consciously beginning to let go of certain responsibilities. She delegated more decisions to Charles, stepped back from some of her regular correspondence, and began spending longer periods simply sitting quietly in her favorite rooms at Balmoral, as if she were taking inventory of memories accumulated over decades of summers in Scotland. One evening in late August, James found the Queen sitting alone in the drawing room where she often spent her evenings, but instead of reading or working on her papers, she was simply looking out the window at the Scottish landscape. When she noticed his presence, she gestured for him to join her. "James," she said, "do you ever wonder what people will remember about us when we're gone?" The question caught him off guard, partly because of its philosophical nature, and partly because it was the first time the Queen had spoken about death in such direct terms. "I think," James replied slowly, "that people will remember the consistency. The way you showed up for the work every day for 70 years, regardless of what was happening in your personal life." "Consistency," the Queen mused. "Yes, I suppose that has been the theme, hasn't it? Sometimes I wonder if that consistency came at too high a cost, if there were times when change might have been better than continuity." James thought about all the moments he had witnessed over the years, the family crises, the constitutional challenges, the personal losses that the Queen had navigated while maintaining her public obligations. "I think," he said carefully, "that your consistency gave people something stable to hold on to during periods when everything else felt uncertain. That has value, even if it required sacrifices." The Queen turned from the window to look at James directly. "And what about you? What has this life cost you personally?" It was a question James had never expected her to ask, and It forced him to confront aspects of his own experience that he had rarely examined. I missed a lot, he admitted. Christmas mornings with my own children, family vacations, ordinary moments that make up most people's lives. But I also witnessed extraordinary things. I saw history being made. I watched remarkable people handle impossible situations, and I learned things about courage and dedication that I never would have discovered otherwise. Do you regret the trade-offs? James considered the question seriously before answering. No, ma'am, I don't. But I understand them differently now than I did when I was younger. I used to think that duty meant suppressing personal feelings. Now I think it means integrating them into your service in a way that makes you more effective, not less. The Queen smiled slightly. That sounds like wisdom earned through experience. I learned it from watching you, ma'am. On September 6, 2022, James was present when the Queen met with Liz Truss for what would prove to be her final official act as monarch. The meeting took place at Balmoral, and James was struck by how the Queen managed to project strength and authority even though she was visibly weakened by her recent health struggles. After Truss departed, the Queen asked James to walk with her in the castle gardens, something that had become part of their routine during her final weeks. They walked slowly, stopping frequently for the Queen to rest, and James noticed that she seemed to be taking inventory of the landscape, as if she were saying goodbye to places that had provided comfort and renewal throughout her life. James, she said during one of their stops, I want to thank you for evolving with this job instead of simply enduring it. You became much more than a guard over the years. You became a witness, a confidant, and, in many ways, a friend. James felt emotion rising in his throat as he realized that this was likely one of their final private conversations. It's been the greatest privilege of my life, ma'am. I hope, the Queen said, that you'll remember us as people who tried to do right, even when we weren't sure what right looked like. I'll remember you, James replied, as someone who showed me that true service isn't about following rules perfectly. It's about caring enough to make difficult choices and live with the consequences. 2 days later, on September 8, 2022, James was on duty when the Queen passed away peacefully at Balmoral. He was not in the room when she died, but he was among the first to be informed, and he was present during the immediate aftermath as the machinery of constitutional transition began to move. Standing in the corridor outside the Queen's room, James reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. He had begun his service as a young man who believed that duty meant emotional detachment and professional distance. Over the course of 26 years, he had learned that real protection sometimes required breaking character, that genuine service often demanded emotional engagement, and that the most profound act of loyalty was allowing yourself to be changed by the people you served. The Queen had taught him that humanity and duty weren't incompatible, they were essential to each other. By allowing him to witness her private struggles and authentic emotions, she had shown him that strength didn't require the suppression of feeling, but rather the integration of feeling into purposeful action. As James prepared to leave royal service and return to private life, he carried with him not just memories of historical moments, but a fundamentally transformed understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. He had learned that the greatest honor wasn't in maintaining perfect protocol, but in bearing witness to the real cost of public service and in providing the kind of human support that allowed others to carry impossible burdens with grace. The Queen Elizabeth James had known was not the sanitized version presented in official biographies or royal documentaries. She was a woman who had spent 70 years navigating the tension between personal desires and public obligations, who had made countless sacrifices while maintaining her essential humanity, and who had found ways to love and grieve and hope within the constraints of an institution that often demanded the suppression of such feelings. James Mitchell's service to the crown had ended, but his understanding of what that service had meant would continue to shape him for the rest of his life. He had been changed by protecting someone who had dedicated her entire existence to something larger than herself, and in that changing, he had discovered the true meaning of both duty and compassion.